Anton, do you remember the other day in Singapore, you were talking about what young people do wrong. What do you think they could do right?
It comes down to a number of things, and they are all connected. But probably one of the most important things, I think, is actually the way people view money.
Right.
And the way there's two main problems with most people in the way that they view money. The first major problem that I've picked up on over the years is people not really understanding the function of money, why it exists. And if you don't understand why money exists and its real function, you tend to have no respect for it. And the second thing is actually to do with emotion towards money. So having some sort of emotional barrier towards money itself. So, with the first one, for example, like for the function of money and the purpose of why it actually exists, we're always told these messages where, like, for example, money is the root of all evil, money doesn't make you happy, the more money you have, the more problems you're going to have. But I just want you to think about it for a second, because it's pretty damn obvious, okay? But people always miss this point. Just imagine a world that didn't have any money in it at all. Money obviously has a function, and in your own time you can go and look at this online, because it's pretty well known amongst people who understand the function of money. So look up the double coincidence of wants. The double coincidence of wants is really important to understanding the function of money, because without money we essentially live in a barter economy, and everything that we're used to consuming in the world now has come about because of the function of money. And it makes society work. It's something that if you understand why it exists, to solve the need of the double coincidence of wants, you respect it more. And people don't get this. So look up the double coincidence of wants and look up the alternatives. So the barter economy, that's the alternative. And we're led to believe a lot of the time that wanting money is a bad thing, and people blur the lines between wanting to do better for yourself and your family and that type of greed, and the greed of harming or abusing other people, and money is the medium through that. So one, in my mind, is a positive greed, in that you want to do better for yourself and you want to do better for your family. In my mind, there's nothing wrong with that. So when you understand the function of money and capital markets, you understand that it's absolutely necessary for them to exist. Because in all circumstances in history, when capital has been locked out of the market and left, there's been widespread depression. Yeah. Money makes society work. And a small problem is that these days it's very popular to have this view of the world, this view of money, that the system is broken and doesn't work. Well, it does, because there is no better alternative. It's not perfect, but there's no better alternative. Okay, so the other day we talked about the function of money and not understanding the function of money and what it's there for, but also talked about the emotional aspects towards money. The other thing that people really get wrong is mixing up what an asset is and what a liability is. And if you remember the other day when we talked about the function of money, we talked about capital markets and we talked about money being a commodity and money actually having a price. Well, in the debt market, the price of money is interest, and in the equity markets, the price is that you're giving away an equity stake in your company, and that's whether you're going to the public markets to raise equity capital or you're in the private market raising equity capital. But debt and equity is very different. So equity, when you're raising capital and giving equity in return, that's not necessarily a liability, because it can actually be an asset. The investor or investors coming to your company who you're giving to an equity stake to can actually bring something to the table and add value to your company. Now the debt market's totally different because you're paying interest and you're doing it on a schedule. Yes. And you have a liability to make those payments on that schedule. And there's two ways of looking at it. There's debt within a company and debt that you take on personally. Now, when you take on debt in a company, you're the director of the company and you borrow money and the business has the exposure. The company has the exposure to the debt, not you personally. So although it's still a liability, it's a different liability. Inside a company, when you take on debt, the company is limited liability. Therefore, you as a person do not have the exposure, the company does. Now, when you take on debt personally, you're taking on the risk. You're signing up for the scheduled payments. And that is a liability that's different to when you do it through a company. Because if you don't stick to the payment schedule, then it means that you personally could end up insolvent, not a company, which is totally different. So even though debt is a liability in companies and taking on personally, it's a different type of liability. So for example, mortgages, that's the biggest liability somebody will ever take on in their life. But for the bank, that's an asset. Now, it's obviously much more preferable to buy that asset in cash, because you could end up paying 2.5, 3 times more for the property that you want to purchase, but you're doing it on a mortgage. You're taking a mortgage to purchase it. No wealthy people have liabilities. Wealthy people stick to the principle that they don't want to take on liabilities, they want to own assets. To do things is actually build up your business. So work for yourself, build up a business. It can still be done if you're working for a business or a corporation, but it's more difficult. You've just got to live well within your means, and you've got to have no liabilities. So liabilities like we talked about earlier with mortgages, overdraft facilities, credit cards, taking loans to buy cars, stuff like this. You've got to have no liabilities and you've got to save. And even if you have to rent, for example, or share an apartment for 10, 15 years, you've got to be prepared to do that, and you've got to drop your pride. Setting up businesses, if that's the choice you're going to make, there's a million ways to make $1 million. You can start off small, and you don't have to have hundreds of thousands of pounds, hundreds of thousands of dollars to start businesses off. Most small businesses you can start off with nothing. So if that's something that you want to do, that's the way you have to do it. You have to start small and build this asset base. So during that entire period, going from zero up to owning assets, it's saving and having no liabilities. And in its entirety, what you're trying to do is essentially build your own infrastructure. So you're building your own pension one year. And this is why everybody downgrades their lifestyle when they retire or rely on their children to pay for their retirement. That's not something you want to be doing. You know, if you want to be wealthy, you want to be building your own pension, not outsourcing it, but insourcing your pension. If you don't like where you are, if you don't like what's happening at any moment in time in your country or where you are elsewhere, you own your dream life already. You can just get on a plane and leave. And there's no downside to life because you've got what you want already. And traveling gives you that. Traveling as early as possible in your life makes you appreciate freedom, working on your own schedule, working on your own time agenda, and also what's possible, what you can actually go and own as your perfect dream life. And once you understand that, you go to work to get it, and you know what's at the end of the road. You know why you're doing it, and it brings total clarity. And that is why traveling is so important.
So Anton, you've made a career based on risk, essentially, managing risk. How would you say young people should calculate which risks to take?
Okay, well, I think with risk, what it comes down to is people tend to look at risk incorrectly. So they look at risk in the two-dimensional traditional sense, which is to look at risk where you say, okay, the more risk I take, the more potential reward or loss I can have. So that's looking at it two-dimensionally. The more risk I take, the more volatility I have, essentially. When in reality, in the real world, risk is actually subjective to your own personal situation. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take, for example, a jobs scenario. So let's say, for example, you've got a job where you're earning $50,000 a year, and you believe that having that job is safe. There's no risk. But let's move on one step forward from that. Let's say, for example, you want to quit your job. So if you want to quit your job with no risk, you line up another job beforehand and you agree a higher salary with another employer, and you move on to that other job by quitting your current job. So you line it up before. But let's say we scrap that and just say, okay, well, what if I just quit my job? What's the likelihood of me ever earning more than $50,000 a year in the future? Well, when you look at this and you calculate downside versus upside, it's pretty obvious. I mean, let's calculate the downside first. So what can you possibly earn that's less than 50,000? Well, you can earn 40,000 a year, 30,000 a year, 20,000 a year, zero. You know, your downside is 50,000. But the real downside in reality is very small. You know, it's very likely that you're going to earn somewhere around 50 or just less than that. So that's calculating the downside. But what about the upside? Well, your upside is actually all the money in the world. It's infinite. It's infinite. So even if you have a very, very small percentage chance of earning infinity, or all the money in the world, you're still earning more than 50,000. So your downside is very small and your upside is huge. Step outside yourself and get the clarity. Work towards it. And then try to position yourself in scenarios all the time where you have very limited downside and business risk, but huge upside. And for me, that's the key. So if you understand that risk is subjective, you can then take the next step to working towards being objective and then getting yourself in that scenario, calculating downside versus upside correctly, and repeating it an infinite amount of times. If you do that well, you'll become wealthy.
Okay, because I've just been thinking, yesterday we were talking about risk, how people calculate it wrong.
Yeah.
And it's just this running theme over the past week or so. We've been talking about people calculating things wrong, making the wrong decisions when it comes to their money and their lives. Why don't people know this stuff?
Well, really what it comes down to is the traditional education system. This stuff isn't taught in the traditional education system. And what you've actually got to do is seek out alternative education and seek out mentors, so successful people that do not have a conflict of interest. Now, if you can manage to do that, then you set yourself up in a situation where your education begins when you leave school or university. And that's what people have to remember. Really, your education doesn't start until you leave school or university, because that's the real world. And you have to seek out the alternative education, say no to your parents in terms of financial advice and career advice. If, for example, your parents are not wealthy, they're cash flow poor, they're asset poor, they don't know what they're talking about, they're wrong, they've made all the wrong decisions themselves. So you have to seek out the alternative education, you have to seek out the mentors that don't have the conflict of interest. Okay, so I just felt like we had to capture this. Like, I just wanted you to get this so I could show you something. You know what we were talking about with the traditional education system? Well, look what's happening here right now. This is the end result, okay? So all of these guys were on London Bridge, okay? They're all walking to London Bridge station from the city. I think it's about 20 past 5 right now. If you come in the morning, they're all walking the other way. Now, this is the end result. They've all got the corporate job, they've got the monthly salary, they've probably all got liabilities every month. And essentially what they're doing in this labour market is they're working for nothing, because at the end of every month, their salary's coming in, net, they've got their liabilities, they pay out, what's left they spent. So essentially, they're swapping their time for free. That's what they're doing. That's the end result of coming through the traditional system. And this is what they've got. And I don't like seeing it. And it's to me it's just madness. They don't get anything in return. Learn to value your time. That is a majorly important factor of going on the road to success. Well, this is exactly really what I've been talking about in terms of valuing your time. So, we had that discussion about valuing time.
Sure.
And how people don't value their time generally. Well, the smartphone is a perfect illustration of that. And I ditched my smartphone 2.5 years ago. I used to have a BlackBerry. And since I actually ditched the BlackBerry, I've been the most efficient I've ever been in my career. So I get 200-300 emails per day. Now, if I actually spent the time to go through every single one of those emails each day, I would actually never get anything done. That's about it. Now, apart from the email function on smartphones, you've also got messaging systems. Now, these instant messaging systems with all these notifications, combine that with emails. With a smartphone, my phone would literally be pinging during the working day every 2 or 3 minutes. And it's just a huge distraction. And think about what people do on these messaging systems. Most of the time, they're just talking to people that they don't really know about nothing that adds any value to either person in that conversation. Right. So, I grew up in an era, something as well that, a lot of people ask me is, if you're in the financial markets, how is it even possible for you to keep in touch with what's going on without having a smartphone? And I think that's the most ridiculous question ever. Because if you understand financial markets, you understand that everything that comes on your phone via mainstream media will never make you money in the financial markets. It's responsive to what's already happened in the past.
Does it have utility?
Well, general or wider news media is really the same in terms of utility as financial news media. They're both pretty useless if you want, or if your objective is freedom and success. Because what you actually need to have, as we've discussed already, is objectivity, clarity, and independence of thought in order to put yourself on that road to freedom and success. And the wider news media is really useless because it has an agenda. So, all this media being pumped out every single day, just because it's available doesn't mean it's good for you. So very similar to the smartphone example with financial news media. There's kind of no excuse today because media can now be consumed in formats and bite-sized pieces that are personally tailored to your objectives. So newspapers, TV, even online generalist media is 99% of it useless for you. Self-proclaimed celebrity or celebrities end up by default becoming young people's role models. And modern celebrity is not famous for anything. They're just famous for being celebrities. They don't have anything concrete. They don't have any track record background. They're essentially disposable commodities for the wider media agenda. They're basically jesters or clowns. And tomorrow they'll be gone. They'll be disposed of. And if you're looking for role models, the way you should pick them and the principle you should stick to is look for role models that are tangible and suit your objective. So role models that have long-lasting success and track record in what you want to do, that suit your objective. And as long as you stick to that principle, you'll be fine. If you aspire to be that, then you should be looking for role models and mentors that have actually achieved that and have long-lasting success and track record. And it doesn't necessarily have to be me.